1,723 voices recorded, 0 people informed. In a silent room on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett stared down Elon Musk and exposed a truth so chilling it made even Congress stop breathing. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't politics as usual. It was a modern reckoning. In a world racing toward progress, where convenience is sold as compassion and data is harvested in silence, one woman stood up and said, "No more." What you're about to witness is a dramatized account inspired by real events, real technologies, and real concerns raised in communities across America. While this story is fictional, the emotions are not. The questions it raises about power, privacy, and justice are as real as the fear in a mother's eyes when she learns her home was being watched. So lean in, because this isn't just a story about Jasmine Crockett versus Elon Musk. It's a story about us, about what we're willing to trade for safety and what it costs when no one asks for our permission. The temperature in the room didn't change, but the energy did, immediately and unmistakably. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the heavy double doors of room 216 opened again, this time not cautiously, but deliberately. The click of polished shoes echoed against the marble as Elon Musk entered, dressed in a black-on-black ensemble so precise it bordered on theatrical. He didn't glance at the people already seated. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply paused for half a second beneath the overhead lights, long enough for every camera to catch him, and then moved forward with the calm arrogance of a man who had spent a lifetime walking into rooms he thought he owned. The silence was thick, not out of respect, but tension. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably. Others straightened their posture. One aide subtly reached for their notepad without making a sound. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes followed him, but her expression remained unreadable. He hadn't brought a team. No lawyers, no lobbyists, no legal counsel. That fact alone told her everything she needed to know. He thought this was a formality, not a confrontation. Musk reached the designated seat and slowly removed his sunglasses, placing them on the table with unnecessary care. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on each committee member, then landing on Jasmine Crockett with a look that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite dismissal, more like a challenge, the kind that said, "Let's see what you've got." But Jasmine didn't blink. She had spent years studying eyes like his, cold, calculating, engineered to project control while hiding panic. He leaned into the microphone, fingers steepled, voice low but firm. "I understand we're here to discuss innovation," he said, as if reading from a script only he could see. "Let's get to the point." His tone was polite, smooth, too smooth. He spoke not like a man defending himself, but like a man presenting a keynote. His words flowed effortlessly, molded by years of press conferences and TED-style proclamations, and yet the cracks were already there. You could hear it if you were trained to listen, not in what he said, but in what he skipped. He didn't ask why the meeting had no staff. He didn't comment on the camera already recording. He didn't even seem curious about the list of unfamiliar faces seated around the horseshoe table. To Jasmine, it was clear. Elon Musk wasn't surprised because he had expected this, or worse, orchestrated it. But what he hadn't expected was her. She let him talk. That was part of the plan. Let the man monologue. Let him feel comfortable. Let him believe he had command of the room. Then, when the moment was right, cut him off at the knees with truth. Still seated, Jasmine clicked her folder open. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She simply asked, "Mr. Musk, before we begin, can you confirm whether Neuror AI is currently active in any U.S. counties without federal disclosure?" It was a surgical question, clean, quiet, but under it was a detonator. Musk's brow didn't furrow, but his left hand curled slightly, thumb tapping against the polished wood table once, then again. He didn't answer right away, because now he realized this wasn't a product launch. It was an indictment. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't the audience. She was the reckoning. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence in room 216 was already thick enough to crush anything careless. As Elon Musk let the weight of her question settle, Jasmine calmly lifted the small remote from her folder. The screen behind her came alive. not with charts, not with maps or data points, but with a blank white slide and one line of black text centered in the middle. It read, "Public service automation is not a right to surveillance. No border, no logo, no color. Just 7 words, so stark, so unembellished, they hit harder than 1,000 pages of testimony." The moment the words appeared, the mood shifted. You could feel it in the way shoulders straightened, in the way eyes darted between Jasmine and the screen, like something seismic had just happened, and no one was sure if they were ready for the aftershock. The simplicity of the slide made it feel almost holy, like an indictment etched in stone. Musk leaned back slightly. His hand stopped tapping. His gaze flicked to the screen, then back to Jasmine. His mouth opened just enough to suggest a response, then shut again. Jasmine still hadn't looked at him. She kept her eyes on the text. She let it hang there, heavy, like smoke that wouldn't rise. "Before anyone talks about progress," she said quietly, "we need to agree on something. Convenience is not consent. Efficiency is not immunity. Innovation is not an excuse to bypass the Constitution." Her voice didn't rise. It drilled, steady, controlled, merciless. "We are not here to celebrate artificial intelligence. We are here to ask why real people were being treated like test subjects in their own homes." She clicked the remote again. This time a second slide replaced the first. Grayscale tables, blocky headers, a list of counties in alphabetical order. 38 in total. Jasmine spoke without looking up. "This is a partial list of jurisdictions where Neuro AI's surveillance system was deployed. According to internal memos, these locations were selected based on demographic fluidity and algorithmic pliability, 2 phrases that appear nowhere in any federal policy document. The term algorithmic pliability rippled through the room like a drop of ice in boiling water. Most people had never heard it, and Jasmine knew that. That was the point. Musk shifted in his seat. The smirk he had walked in with had begun to falter, just at the corners. Jasmine turned to him now, slowly, deliberately, and asked, "Mr. Musk, were you aware that your company's AI programs were activated in counties with majority Black and Latino populations first?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was precise, like a surgeon asking if the patient remembered where they'd felt the first ache. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. She clicked again. The screen changed a third time. This one wasn't a slide. It was a still image from a security feed. A young Black boy, no older than 10, was walking home from school. The caption beneath read, "Subject behavior, unstructured. Compliance score, 62.14. Risk flag, active." The image stayed on screen. No animation, no commentary, just cold, hard observation. And a boy who didn't know he'd been turned into a data set. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. "That child doesn't know his name is in your system. His parents don't know they've been flagged. But your software did. It decided he was a risk before he ever made it home. That's not innovation, Mr. Musk. That's profiling dressed up in code." The room stayed still. The cameras didn't blink. And for the first time that morning, neither did Elon Musk. Jasmine reached into her folder once more and withdrew a thin USB drive, silver and unmarked. She held it between her fingers, not to show it off, but to make the moment deliberate, intentional. Then without a word, she plugged it into the side port of the government-issued laptop in front of her. The screen behind her flickered, shifted from the still image of the child to a loading symbol, and then, after a beat, a grainy video began to play. There was no dramatic music, no narration. Just the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the echo of chairs being dragged across tile, and the ambient noise of life inside a community center in Midland County, Texas. The footage wasn't high definition. It wasn't meant to be seen. It had been captured by a device no bigger than a salt shaker, placed on a countertop next to a tray of free pamphlets about food stamps and Medicaid renewal deadlines. People moved in and out of frame, women in scrubs, men in work boots, an elderly couple carrying plastic bags full of medication. None of them looked at the device. None of them seemed to know they were being recorded. Jasmine let the silence work. The audience, congressional aides, staffers, even Musk, were forced to sit in it. And then came the moment. A woman's voice, worn but warm. You said the doctor will be here next Thursday? Another voice, younger, replied, That's what the paper said, but I don't trust it. Remember last time? Laughter followed, light, familiar, the kind that comes from years of shared hardship. Then a pause. The first voice again. Sometimes I wonder if all this is worth it. The help, the forms. Feels like they want us to give up. Jasmine clicked pause. The frame froze on the older woman's face, creased with time, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but still holding something unbroken. Jasmine took a breath. That woman never consented to be recorded, she said. Her name is Mrs. Edna Harris. She's 72 years old. She's lived in Midland County her entire life. She volunteers at that center twice a week, helping new moms apply for food assistance. She's never broken a law. She's never posed a threat. And yet, over 1,700 conversations like this were recorded, without knowledge, without warrants, without a single congressional briefing, all logged, all analyzed, all stored. Someone at the far end of the room shifted. A pen clicked. Musk remained motionless, but his eyes had narrowed. Jasmine continued, Neuro or A, I classified these recordings as ambient behavioral captures. That's the term used in the internal schema. According to the metadata, each clip was assigned a compliance score based on vocal tone, language patterns, and inferred trust in government systems. Mrs. Harris, according to your software, scored a 48.22. That placed her in a category labeled institutional resistance risk. She let the phrase settle, so sterile, so clinical, it sounded more like a cancer diagnosis than a civil rights violation. She stepped forward, not grandstanding, just closer. That phrase, institutional resistance risk, doesn't exist in any law, Mr. Musk. It doesn't exist in any public health statute. It exists in one place, your server, a private algorithm funded by public money, now judging who's obedient enough to receive help. No one moved. The screen behind her still displayed Mrs. Harris's frozen expression. Jasmine didn't look at the camera. She looked at Musk. And then she said it, quiet but cutting. You didn't just record her. You labeled her, and you never asked. Jasmine didn't wait for a reaction. The silence had already said enough. With a steady hand, she pulled a manila folder from the bottom of her stack and opened it with surgical care. Inside were a series of government documents, some publicly archived, most buried so deep in subcommittee filings they were nearly invisible. She walked to the screen again, clicked to the next slide, and the committee chamber filled with the image of a contract header stamped with 3 seals: the Department of Energy, SpaceX Federal Research Division, and a company logo no one in the room recognized until Jasmine said it aloud. Neuro or AI. This, she said, tapping the edge of the screen, is a federal funding agreement filed under Project New Terra, Phase 3. It was approved by a subcommittee that hasn't met in public session since 2021. The funding was masked under infrastructure grants, highways, water, public data systems. But buried in Section 12, Clause 5, is this phrase, authorization for automated community response optimization through neural feedback learning. She turned to the room. That's the legal camouflage for surveillance. The phrase lingered, dry and clinical, but under Jasmine's voice it burned. She advanced to the next page. The camera zoomed in on a signature at the bottom of the scanned document. Here's where things get interesting. This signature belongs to a man named Jordan Wilkes. He was listed as the oversight officer for this contract. She paused, letting the name hang for a beat. Only problem is, Jordan Wilkes died 6 months before this was signed. The ripple in the room was instant. Musk's fingers shifted just slightly against the tabletop, his expression unchanged but his posture tighter. A few committee members leaned in. Jasmine kept going, her voice like a slow blade. That's not the only anomaly. Several of these contracts, spanning 12 counties in Texas, 8 in Georgia, and 5 in Illinois, carry mismatched timestamps. Some were backdated, others predated federal authorization. In short, Mr. Musk, someone manufactured the paper trail to make it appear as if Congress was involved. She returned to her seat but didn't sit. We weren't. No hearings, no briefings, no votes, Just quiet signatures routed through administrative channels where watchdogs rarely look. And yet, through those shadows, your company gained access to over 2 million citizens. Their streets, their homes, their voices. Her gaze hardened. You didn't win trust. You bypassed it. Musk finally stirred. My company followed the protocols provided, he said, his voice smooth but slightly strained. We delivered innovation where the government was too slow to act. Jasmine didn't smile. You didn't innovate. You infiltrated. There's a difference. She walked back to the laptop and clicked to the next slide. This time, a visual heat map of the deployment zones. Most were in low-income areas. Over 80% were communities of color. What's also worth noting, she added, is that none of this data is included in the public performance reports for these programs, which means someone made the conscious decision to separate the real impact from the official record. She looked directly at Musk now. You've built rockets to leave Earth, Mr. Musk. But this was built to dig into it, into people's lives without their knowledge and without their vote. And that's not innovation. That's an invasion. Jasmine didn't flinch as she clicked to the final slide in her sequence. The screen went dark for a second, then lit up with a header that made several committee members instinctively lean forward. Face Map 54, Deployment Protocol Overview. Beneath the title was a grid, columns and rows filled with terms like subject indexing, recognition lag time, capture zone radius, and most damning of all, behavioral predictive flagging. The document wasn't an analysis. It wasn't theoretical. It was operational. This was the blueprint of a living system, one that had already been activated. Jasmine looked at Musk but spoke to the entire room. This document, she began, is dated March 2nd of this year. It outlines the implementation of 423 facial recognition units across 13 neighborhoods from Chicago to New Orleans. The signature on the approval form belongs to a senior engineer at NeuroAura AI, someone whose credentials link directly to SpaceX internal systems. She took a beat, letting that settle. And yet, Mr. Musk just told this committee his companies don't collect biometric data. Musk didn't respond. His jaw tensed, but he remained quiet. His legal team, seated several rows behind, exchanged glances but didn't speak. They knew, as did everyone in the room, that this wasn't just another accusation. This was a contradiction, a provable lie. Jasmine zoomed in on the operational zones. These aren't random locations, she said. They're algorithmically selected using socioeconomic filtering. That means lower-income zip codes, predominantly Black and Latino communities, public housing corridors, bus stations, school zones. She gestured toward a red-highlighted portion of the map. Here in East Baton Rouge, 6 cameras were installed on one block. And yet, according to official city infrastructure logs, no permit was ever filed. She clicked again, bringing up side-by-side footage. One from a street camera's field of vision, the other from a school hallway. The same technology, the same labeling system in the corner of the screen. This is the Face Map 54 system in action, real-time behavioral analysis. It scores posture, micro-expressions, clothing, and direction of movement. From that, it generates a proximity concern level. In other words, it flags people as potential threats based on how they walk, how they look, and whether their eyes wander too long near a government building. Jasmine's voice grew colder, not louder, just sharper. It doesn't need a reason, it just needs a pattern. And patterns, she added, are easy to manipulate when the system was built to see certain people as problems before they even speak. She stepped aside so the screen was in full view. These aren't prototypes, they're live. And as of last month, they've logged over 1.2 million behavioral entries, all tagged and time-stamped, none of which are available to the individuals being monitored. No notices, no appeals, no opt-outs. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Jasmine walked back to the witness table and sat down with deliberate calm. She folded her hands over her folder and fixed her gaze on Musk, who now stared blankly at the table in front of him. What you've built, she said, is not a smart city solution. It's a silent sentencing system, one that doesn't need a courtroom, a judge, or even a crime. It just needs a face. And if that face looks like mine, like most of the people in this room, then it scores faster. And this time, Even the cameras paused. The committee room had gone so still, it felt like time itself had slowed. Every eye remained fixed on the screen behind Jasmine, but she didn't turn to it. She simply picked up the remote once more, clicked twice, and dimmed the lights slightly. The projection shifted. What appeared next wasn't a slide or a document, but a video feed. Blurry at first, the background shadowed, the subject's face digitally obscured. A voice filtered through, mechanized, distorted to protect its source. But it was clear, deliberate, and unmistakably real. The figure adjusted slightly in their seat, as if the weight of what they were about to say was almost too much to carry. Jasmine didn't introduce him by name. She didn't need to. "This," she said softly, "is a former lead systems engineer at NeuroOr AI. He was involved in the design and deployment of the surveillance modules we've just discussed. And what he's about to reveal will explain why none of this was ever meant to be made public." The voice spoke, calm but shaken. "I was part of the core implementation team for Project FaceMap 54, as well as its preliminary pilot phases under the New Terra initiative. From the beginning, we knew what we were building wasn't just predictive tech, it was evaluative. Every person who interacted with our systems, knowingly or unknowingly, was assigned a compliance score. That score determined what ads they saw, how long their license renewals took, whether their applications for benefits were flagged for manual review, even which bus routes would run through their neighborhoods." A sharp intake of breath could be heard from somewhere in the room. Jasmine didn't move. She wanted the room to sit with it, to truly feel the enormity of that statement. The whistleblower continued. It wasn't advertised that way. Public-facing language said it was efficiency enhancement or urban automation support. But inside the system, behind the code, we knew what we were doing. We were turning people into data first and citizens second. The screen shifted again, showing a blurred-out screenshot of a developer interface. Columns of compliance scores beside names, ages, and addresses. Red warning flags were visible next to certain profiles. One had the label, "Risk Priority Override, Manual Escalation Recommended." The voice returned. "This wasn't just about data collection. This was about control. And the moment I realized we were scoring people based on how often they opened public assistance emails or how many times their phones connected near a protest site, that's when I knew something had gone terribly wrong." The camera panned slightly across the room. A few members of Congress looked visibly shaken. One, who had spent the first half of the hearing casually checking their phone, now sat frozen, fingers laced tightly. Even Musk, normally unreadable, had gone pale. The video feed continued. "I tried to raise concerns internally. I submitted 3 anonymous reports to the Department of Technology Oversight. I never received a reply. Within 2 weeks, my access was revoked. I was reassigned to an R&D team in an unrelated department, and all my prior credentials were deleted from the system. That's when I knew this wasn't a glitch. This was policy." Jasmine let the final seconds play out, then paused the video just as the man bowed his head on screen. The silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was suffocation. She spoke once more, quiet but unrelenting. "If what he's saying is true, then we're not just looking at misuse of technology. We're looking at the quiet construction of a digital caste system, where privacy is optional and fairness is programmable. And the scariest part?" She looked around the room. "None of us voted for it." Jasmine didn't rush her words. She knew better than anyone that truth, when heavy enough, didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be spoken clearly. She stepped back into the center of the room, letting the image of the anonymous engineer frozen on the screen behind her linger like a ghost over the hearing. Then she took a breath, calm but firm, and addressed the entire committee. "What we've just heard isn't science fiction. It's not paranoia. It's an algorithm designed to rank human beings like products in an online store. Except these rankings determine who gets served and who gets sidelined, who gets access to basic rights, and who gets digitally erased without ever knowing it happened." Her voice grew colder, not with anger, but precision. "And the most dangerous part? It doesn't feel like violence. It feels like nothing at all." She turned to a new slide, this one, a case file stripped of name and photo, but tied to a ZIP code in rural Georgia. "This is a real example," she explained. "Single mother, 2 kids, no criminal record. She applied for public housing and food assistance. All documents in order, but her application was flagged. Why? Jasmine tapped the lower half of the slide. Because the algorithm noted low engagement with digital civic content and frequent location overlap with flagged individuals. In other words, she didn't open enough government emails, and she lived near people the system didn't like. There were audible gasps. One congresswoman mouthed the words, "That's real?" Jasmine nodded once. This mother was given no explanation, no appeal, just a rejection. She didn't know she was in a database. She didn't know her movements were being tracked, but the system knew, and it decided she was a risk. Jasmine paused and looked toward Musk, who still hadn't spoken. "Let me be very clear," she said, her tone sharpened like glass. "Your technology didn't just gather information. It assumed intent. It penalized people based on probability. It took quiet lives and reduced them to trend lines and trigger words." She changed the slide again, revealing a chart labeled Behavioral Confidence Thresholds. It listed variables like eye contact duration, pause before response time, and tone inflection variance. Each variable had a numerical weight. "According to this model," Jasmine said, "if someone hesitates before answering a government worker, the system lowers their trust score. If they show nervous body language, the score drops again. If their phone was detected near a protest in the last 60 days, the red flag goes up automatically." The room began to shift. The disbelief from earlier was mutating into something else. Disgust, maybe even fear. Jasmine pressed in. "You call this innovation, Mr. Musk, but it's not. This is not about improving government. This is about judging people without their knowledge, convicting them without a courtroom, and punishing them without appeal. It is oppression, digitized, sanitized, and automated." Then in a tone softer but infinitely more piercing, she said, "And the people it affects the most are the ones who never even knew they were in the system." She let that sit. No one interrupted. No one reached for water. The screen behind her glowed with quiet menace, and at the center of the storm sat Elon Musk, face locked in stone, as Jasmine Crockett prepared to peel back one final layer. The screen faded to black, but the damage lingered. Jasmine stood quietly for a moment, letting the weight of what had just been said settle not just in the minds of the committee, but in their conscience. She knew most of them weren't ready to hear this. Not because they didn't believe it, but because they suspected it all along and never looked closely enough to prove it. But now the proof was staring them in the face, and the truth was unavoidable. She turned toward the committee chair and asked softly, "May I show one more clip?" He gave a slow nod. Jasmine clicked the remote. The screen came back to life, this time showing a narrow street in a neighborhood just outside Chicago. It was evening, the sun low, the shadows long. The footage came from a mounted camera at the edge of a public housing building. It focused on a single family walking home. A man holding a little girl's backpack, a woman cradling a baby, and a boy, no more than 12, laughing and chasing a plastic bag caught in the wind. Jasmine narrated, her tone gentle but pointed. "This is the Grant family, hardworking, quiet, no criminal record, never missed a rent payment. Their son Devin plays trumpet in his middle school band. Last year, his face was captured by a face map, 54 node, mounted on a light post above this very sidewalk. According to the system's log, he lingered in front of a government building for longer than average." She clicked. A text overlay appeared. "Behavioral note, subject loitering, cross-reference proximity to flagged individuals. Score, 59.77, elevated monitoring recommended." "That's what the machine saw," Jasmine said. "Not a child waiting for his sister, not a boy playing with the wind. Just a low score, a low threat, a risk." She paused, letting the words fall like ash. 3 months later, she continued, Devin's mother applied for a small business grant to open a home-based childcare service. It was denied. The rejection letter didn't explain why, but internal records show her address had been flagged under household proximity risk based on one incident, this one. She turned back to the room. "Do you see what happened here? A child laughed too long on a sidewalk, and his family paid the price? Not in jail, not in headlines, just in silence. Quiet, invisible setbacks that no one questions because no one knows they happened. There was no sound in the room except the hum of the air conditioning and the barely audible turning of a pen in someone's hand. Jasmine softened her tone, but not her conviction. This isn't about glitches, Mr. Musk. This isn't about a bug in your code. This is about a system that was built to trust the machine more than it trusts the people it watches. And when that happens, when the algorithm gets to decide who deserves opportunity and who gets shut out, that's when democracy becomes a facade. She clicked one last time, and the screen returned to black. Trust isn't lost overnight, she said. It's lost in pieces. A grant denied. A mother discouraged. A boy scored like a suspect for waiting too long in front of a building. You didn't just break the system, Mr. Musk. She looked at him squarely, her voice barely above a whisper. You broke the people who believed in it. The tension in the room reached a pitch that made even the sound of shifting chairs feel intrusive. Jasmine had just dismantled the illusion of legality that had protected Musk's surveillance empire. And now, on cue, his legal team reacted. A man in a gray suit rose, walked briskly to the front of the chamber, and addressed the chair with carefully measured urgency. Mr. Chairman, he began, voice low but clearly rehearsed, in light of the emotional toll and the public pressure building around this hearing, we respectfully request a recess for the well-being and mental clarity of Mr. Musk, so that he may continue to participate meaningfully in these proceedings. There was a brief ripple across the room, not quite surprise, not quite protest, just the quiet awkwardness of watching someone try to flip the script. For the first time, Elon Musk looked smaller, seated behind his lawyer, eyes averted, jaw still clenched as if forcing himself to play along. Jasmine, still standing beside the witness table, turned toward the chairman, then slowly stepped forward before he could respond. With respect, Mr. Chairman, she said, calm and steady. We've heard a lot today about what Mr. Musk feels, what he thinks, how much weight he carries. But may I remind the room, he is not the one who was watched. She looked down at her folder, then back at the panel. Mrs. Edna Harris didn't get a break when her conversations were recorded in a community center. Devin Grant didn't get a mental health pause when his home address was flagged for increased surveillance. The families in East Baton Rouge, the mothers in rural Georgia, the disabled veterans in Arizona, none of them were given warning, let alone a recess. She turned directly to Musk. The people you monitored, without their knowledge, without their consent, don't get to call time out when the truth becomes inconvenient. They didn't get to say, I'm overwhelmed, I need a moment. They just kept living, quietly, unknowingly, while your systems logged their movements and labeled their lives. Musk's lawyer opened his mouth again, but Jasmine was already moving. She clicked the remote. The next slide appeared, a list of timestamps labeled Compliance Reassessments. It showed that the AI system ran continual evaluations every 72 hours, flagging individuals based on updated behavior patterns, proximity to government buildings, and even changes in sleep schedules based on smartphone data. The last line in the slide read, Recommendation, no break windows scheduled. Jasmine let the irony land on its own. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back to the room. Even your machines didn't believe in breaks, Mr. Musk. There was no need for further debate. The committee chair looked around, then firmly stated, The hearing will proceed. No recess granted. A soft murmur passed through the room, the kind that signaled a shift, not just in tone, but in power. For the first time, Elon Musk had asked for mercy, and for the first time, he didn't get it. The denial of Musk's recess wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. For the first time, the weight of accountability wasn't theoretical, it was real. And Jasmine Crockett knew the window of clarity she had opened in that moment couldn't be wasted. The room had begun to listen, not just hear, but truly listen. And so she shifted from exposure to excavation. It was time to reveal not just what had been done, but how it had been funded. She returned to the laptop and opened a new file. The screen displayed a set of budgetary flowcharts, dry at first glance, the kind of charts bureaucrats buried behind acronyms and footnotes. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd studied every line, every detour, every dollar. She clicked to expand a single node in the visual chain. Adaptive Access Fund. Children's Disability Grant Program. The room froze. This, Jasmine began, is where the money came from. She let the sentence hang for a breath. 4 states, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, diverted a combined $42 million from programs originally earmarked for children with special needs. That money was intended for adaptive learning devices, speech therapy tools, motor skill development platforms, but instead it was funneled, quietly, methodically, into Neuro or AI's behavioral analysis programs under the justification of enhanced support automation. There were audible gasps now, low but unmistakable. A ripple of outrage rolled through the room like a wave that couldn't be swallowed. One of the junior committee members leaned forward in disbelief, mouthing, "Disability funding?" Jasmine nodded solemnly. Yes, funding that should have put speech devices in classrooms ended up buying camera installations in public housing stairwells. Funds meant to help children speak were used to help machines listen. She clicked again. The next slide showed a procurement order stamped urgent implementation and signed by a district contractor attached to a requisition for facial recognition modules and thermal tracking software. In the margin, handwritten in blue pen, was the note, "From D Block Education Pool, no public pushback expected." She didn't need to elaborate. The note explained everything. The decision hadn't just been hidden, it had been calculated. Jasmine turned back to the room. What we're looking at is not just surveillance, it's systemic exploitation of the voiceless, the vulnerable, and the invisible. It's the deliberate rerouting of compassion into control, the theft of care, disguised as efficiency. Her voice dropped, lower now, not for dramatic effect, but because the words themselves were too heavy to shout. Imagine being the parent of a child with a disability, told year after year that the district can't afford better tools, better staff, better access, only to find out the money was there all along. It just wasn't for them. She closed the laptop, slowly, firmly. "This isn't innovation, Mr. Musk," she said. "It's institutional betrayal, wrapped in code, and paid for by the very people who were promised protection." Musk didn't speak. He barely moved. The once untouchable architect of progress now looked like a man realizing that the tower he had built wasn't made of steel, it was made of stolen bricks. And Jasmine had just pulled out the cornerstone. The air inside room 216 had shifted again. Not just with tension, but with something deeper. Grief. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it, no longer just a congresswoman asking questions, but a voice giving shape to what so many families had never been told. She looked out over the committee panel, then slowly raised a printed report, pages bound but worn at the edges. The title read, "Fiscal Year 2024, Reallocation Reports, Adaptive Education to Municipal AI." It wasn't a long document, but it was a brutal one. "This report," she began, "details the redirection of disability assistance funding across 4 states, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi. In total, $42 million earmarked for services like autism therapy, assistive technology, and mobility training for children was siphoned into AI surveillance infrastructure." She let the statement land with full weight, and not one parent was informed. The screen lit up again, this time showing a pie chart with budget reallocations. In one slice, speech therapy devices. In another, AI deployment modules. The shift was undeniable. Jasmine continued, "In East Texas alone, $6.3 million that should have provided digital tablets with communication software for nonverbal children was instead spent on facial recognition towers near Section 8 housing units." One congressman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another lowered their gaze, but Jasmine pressed on. "In Georgia, a program designed to provide specialized transportation for wheelchair-bound students was paused indefinitely. The funds, according to this record, were redirected to urban movement efficiency systems, which is bureaucratic code for behavioral heat mapping." She turned a page in the report, slower now, not for effect, but because she knew what was coming next. Her voice grew softer, almost tender. "In Mississippi, A school district that had just qualified for federal expansion grants to build a sensory-friendly classroom instead used that money to install monitoring nodes in public libraries. Places where children, especially those with processing disorders, go to escape noise and judgment, were turned into silent observation zones. She looked up. Her eyes scanned the room, settling for a brief second on Elon Musk, who still hadn't said a word. You didn't just divert money, Mr. Musk. You diverted hope. You diverted dignity. You diverted the one thing parents of disabled children cling to in this system, the belief that someone is fighting for their child's voice to be heard. She clicked to the next slide. A photo filled the screen, taken from a school in Shreveport, Louisiana. It showed a small empty room, no windows, a carpet square, a single desk. This, the caption read, had been designated as the temporary learning center for children with special needs after the original sensory room was defunded. In the background, outside the windowless wall, was a newly installed black dome camera mounted near the ceiling. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. Finally, she returned to the witness table and sat down slowly, the silence folding around her like gravity. We tell these families to wait. We tell them next year or when there's more funding. But the truth is, we already had the money. We just chose to spend it watching their children instead of helping them. She looked toward the press cameras now, not as a politician, but as a daughter, a neighbor, a citizen. This hearing isn't just about what was done with technology. It's about what was done instead of compassion. And the children who are paying that price don't even know their futures were sold off to fund someone else's power. And for the first time, one of the committee members wiped away a tear. The weight of Jasmine's words had not yet settled when Elon Musk finally shifted. Not the subtle twitch of a wrist or the calculated tilt of a head. This time, he moved with purpose. Slowly, he leaned into the microphone, his fingers interlocked before him, his voice low but firm. "You're misunderstanding the mission," he said. "We are in an era of instability, political, environmental, economic. We are on the brink of chaos, and my goal, my obligation, is to stay ahead of that collapse." He glanced around the room, letting his voice thicken with the gravity he always reserved for keynote stages. "I don't want to control people. I want to protect them, anticipate problems before they become disasters, prevent collapse before it begins." A few heads nodded faintly, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of awe. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She waited until his last word had echoed off the paneling before she stood once more, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her response didn't come in a burst. It was measured, like everything she said when the stakes were high and the mask of power had begun to crack. "Mr. Musk," she began, "your problem isn't that you're not intelligent. Your problem is that you believe genius is permission." She took a step closer, her voice carrying the weight of thousands of constituents who would never stand in a room like this, but lived in the world he was reshaping without consent. "You speak about chaos like you're the only one trying to hold it back. But chaos doesn't start with fire. It starts with fear and the belief that only a chosen few are smart enough to stop it." Her eyes didn't waver. "You built rockets to reach the stars. You built cars to save the climate. But then you built something else, a system designed to watch people, score them, predict them, rank their humanity without ever looking them in the eye. And you didn't stop to ask if you should, because you assumed your intelligence gave you immunity." Musk opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. "You say you're protecting society? But protection without consent is not safety. It's surveillance. It's paternalism in its most dangerous form. You don't get to claim benevolence while hiding behind algorithms that no one can question." The room was locked in silence again. Only this time, it wasn't Jasmine who created it. It was the absence of defense. Musk's usual arsenal, humor, superiority, deflection, none of it worked here. Not against someone who refused to speak in code. Not against someone who refused to be impressed. "Genius didn't make this country great," Jasmine said. "Courage did. Accountability did. People willing to fight for justice did. People who knew they were smart, yes. but knew even more that power unchecked is just tyranny wearing a designer suit. She turned toward the committee. We have allowed innovation to outpace ethics, but the solution isn't to give the inventors more power. It's to remind them that brilliance doesn't place them above the law. Then she turned back to Musk. You've been called a visionary, but vision without restraint isn't leadership. It's domination. And if you're truly as brilliant as they say, you won't need a surveillance empire to prove it. The hearing had not yet adjourned, but the tremors were already spreading far beyond the walls of room 216. Outside, a storm had been building, online, on sidewalks, in newsrooms and living rooms. It began as a whisper, a series of incredulous tweets and shaky cell phone videos of Jasmine Crockett's cross-examinations. But by midday, it had become a roar. Across cable networks, Jasmine's name ticked across the bottom of every screen. Face Scan Gate, Chalk's Trust is Broken, and We're Not Data were trending simultaneously. And at the center of it all stood one name, Elon Musk. Jasmine had barely stepped out of the chamber when the weight of what she'd exposed detonated into the public sphere. Journalists swarmed the Capitol steps. Protesters who had once come in support of net neutrality or education reform now held signs reading, "Genius not equal to permission," and "Surveillance is not safety." Civil rights organizations released joint statements within hours. The ACLU issued a blistering response calling for immediate suspension of all neuro AI contracts nationwide. Even watchdog groups that had once praised Musk's technological ventures were demanding an inquiry. At a tech conference in San Francisco, scheduled to feature a keynote by one of Musk's senior engineers, attendees walked out en masse when the speaker opened with the words, "Let's not overreact to innovation." Their silence was deafening, and it spoke louder than any soundbite. By evening, clips of Jasmine's confrontation with Musk had gone viral across every major platform. One video capturing her final line, "You didn't just break the system, you broke the people who believed in it," had reached over 12 million views in 6 hours. Influential commentators across the political spectrum were forced to take sides. Some defended Musk's intentions, framing him as a visionary misunderstood in a bureaucratic system. But the tide was turning, and fast. In Detroit, a local news affiliate uncovered that a neuro AI sensor had been quietly installed at a public school without parental knowledge. In Phoenix, a whistleblower came forward to say that several grant rejections in low-income districts had been based not on income, but on behavioral metrics generated by FaceMap 54. Each revelation added fuel to the blaze Jasmine had lit. This wasn't just a policy failure, it was a nationwide betrayal, and the public felt it like a bruise turning purple in real time. Inside congressional offices, phone lines were jammed. Staffers reported thousands of calls per hour from constituents demanding answers, resignations, and oversight. Multiple members of Congress who had previously accepted campaign contributions from Musk-linked PACs scrambled to draft statements distancing themselves. Hearings were proposed. Subpoenas were discussed. It was no longer about one man. It was about a system that had operated in the dark for far too long. And still, through it all, Jasmine stayed quiet. No interviews, no social media posts, no press conferences. She let the truth speak. She had done what few in power dared to do, trust the people with the full picture. And now those people were responding, not just with anger, but with action. A grandmother in Ohio who had never owned a smartphone called her senator's office for the first time in her life. A group of high school students in Newark organized a walkout, demanding the removal of all facial recognition tech from their campus. A disabled veteran in Atlanta sent a handwritten letter to Congress, ending with the line, "I fought for a free country, not a watched one." The country was not just outraged, it was awake. And for the first time in a long time, the voice leading that awakening wasn't shouting. It was simply telling the truth and refusing to look away. Inside room 216, Elon Musk remained still. But it was the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, it came from fracture. His hands no longer rested confidently on the table. They gripped the edges as if anchoring him to reality. The titan of tech, the man who once paced global stages with ease and awe, now sat under fluorescent lights, cornered not by outrage, but by evidence. The armor he had worn for decades, charisma, genius, futurism, had cracked, and the world was watching it split apart in real time. Jasmine Crockett, seated just across from him, didn't gloat. There was no need. She had never been there to win a battle of personalities. She came to hold up a mirror, and Musk, for the first time, couldn't look away from the reflection. The committee chair cleared his throat. "Mr. Musk," he said, "you've remained silent through most of this hearing. Before we move toward formal proceedings, is there anything you'd like to say for the record?" The room froze. For a moment it seemed Musk wouldn't speak at all. But then, slowly, he adjusted his microphone. He looked not at the chairman, nor at Jasmine, but down at his own folded hands. When he spoke, his voice was low, quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "I never set out to build something malicious," he said. "I believed we could make the world smarter, safer. I believed data could protect people, predict problems, save lives." He paused. His breath caught slightly. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking who gets left out, who gets hurt when the machine doesn't see them as human." Jasmine didn't respond. Her silence wasn't a rejection. It was respect for a truth too long buried. Musk glanced up, eyes glassy but defiant. "You think I'm a villain?" he said, voice steadying. "But I'm terrified of collapse, of losing what we've built. I thought if we could just get ahead of the future, maybe we wouldn't repeat the past." "You didn't get ahead," Jasmine finally said, voice gentle but unwavering. "You got above. You elevated yourself above the people you claim to protect, and you stopped seeing them as people at all." The words didn't sting. They landed. And for a long, aching second, Musk didn't blink. The mirror wasn't cracking anymore. It was breaking. He leaned back, hands unclenching. "So what happens now?" he asked, not to Jasmine, not to the room, but perhaps to no one. Jasmine looked at him, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Now," she said, "you listen. For once, you don't speak. You don't code. You don't control. You just listen to the people you never thought could hold you accountable." And in that moment, the man who built rockets to leave Earth, who spoke of Mars and machines and immortality, looked more grounded than ever before, because for the first time, he had nowhere else to go. There were no fireworks when it happened. No shouting, no dramatic verdict from the chair. Just a stillness so profound it felt sacred. In that quiet, something irreversible took place. Not the fall of a man, but the rise of a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't call for applause. She simply closed her folder, placed her pen beside it, and leaned back into her chair. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had finally taken its rightful place at the center of the room, and everyone could feel it. Outside the chamber, a crowd had swelled beyond the barricades. Parents, students, veterans, caretakers, many of whom had never set foot in a government building, stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on phones and portable screens. What they witnessed wasn't just a hearing, it was the validation of everything they'd been feeling for years, but had no words to explain. Jasmine had given voice to the discomfort that had sat in their bones, unspoken, as cameras followed them at grocery stores, as services became more automated, as help grew colder and harder to reach. Inside, the energy shifted as reporters were ushered back in. But this time, their lenses didn't immediately swing toward Musk. They turned to Jasmine, not because she had gone viral or because she had won an argument, but because she had made the truth undeniable, and done it without cruelty, without spectacle, and without flinching. One by one, committee members began speaking, not into microphones, but in hushed, shaken tones to one another. The Republican member who had earlier defended innovation over regulation now sat with his arms folded, eyes lowered in deep thought. Another, once dismissive, was seen scrolling through the face map deployment records Jasmine had presented, her fingers trembling slightly. Jasmine didn't press them. She knew real change rarely begins with shouting. It begins with silence that can no longer be ignored. Musk, still seated, didn't speak again. His expression wasn't defiant anymore. It was distant. The mirror had shattered, and he was no longer looking through it. He was trying, perhaps for the first time, to see what others had seen all along. The chair finally addressed the room. This committee will move to suspend all pending federal partnerships with Neuro AI and SpaceX subsidiaries until a full investigation is completed. There were no cheers, just a nod from Jasmine, a small one, enough to acknowledge the moment, not as a victory, but as a beginning. As the gavel came down and the room began to empty, Jasmine stood slowly. She gathered her notes not like a politician who had just scored points, but like a teacher collecting graded papers. She had not come to destroy a man. She had come to defend people he had forgotten, and the country noticed. That evening, as networks played clips and headlines screamed of empires shaken, a quiet phrase began circulating online, repeated by parents, teachers, veterans, and teenagers alike. She didn't try to be the hero. She made the truth the hero. And in a world drowning in noise, that was what people were hungry for most. By the time Jasmine Crockett returned to her office, the hallway outside was lined with people she didn't recognize. Staffers, strangers, even custodians, who nodded at her, some offering quiet thanks, others too overcome to speak. The hearing room had emptied, but something larger had been set in motion, something that wasn't confined to walls or wrapped in legal language. It was spreading across the country like a tide, slow, deep, and impossible to stop. That night, in a small town in rural Kansas, a public library held a last-minute town hall meeting. Parents had seen clips of Jasmine's hearing and discovered, to their horror, that the library's new community feedback kiosks were manufactured by a Neuro or AI subsidiary. Within 48 hours, the devices were removed. In Chicago, school officials voted unanimously to suspend their contract with the city's behavioral tracking pilot program. The students who once passed unnoticed beneath those cameras now walked home under open skies, their shadows no longer tagged by invisible scores. But perhaps the most telling ripple came in the form of a letter Jasmine received, handwritten, unmarked, folded neatly into an envelope that looked like it had been touched by 1,000 miles of wear. Inside was a single page. The writing was uneven, the ink faded, but every word felt heavier than the paper it was written on. Dear Miss Crockett, I don't know politics. I don't understand algorithms. But I know what it feels like to be watched and still feel invisible. My son has autism. He doesn't speak much, but he notices everything. Last week he asked me why the new cameras at his school beeped every time he walked by. I didn't have an answer, but after watching you, I do now. Thank you for not speaking over anyone. Thank you for seeing what others didn't, for reminding us that being brilliant isn't the same as being right. We needed someone to make them stop looking through us. You did that. A mother who finally slept. Jasmine didn't cry. She couldn't. Not yet. But she read the letter twice. Then again. She didn't file it away. She placed it inside the inner pocket of her suit jacket and buttoned it closed like a vow. Outside her window, Washington moved on as if unchanged. Sirens, headlines, interviews. But she knew better. She could feel it in the stillness between the noise. Something had shifted, not because a billionaire had been exposed, but because someone ordinary, quiet, scared, unseen, had finally felt like they were heard, and the ripples weren't done yet. The morning after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood on the Capitol steps alone. No cameras, no reporters, just the faint hum of early traffic and the cool air curling through the marble columns. In her hands, she held a thick binder, draft legislation. It wasn't flashy. It didn't bear her name in bold letters. But it was real. Titled plainly, the Data Dignity and Consent Act. It was the next step in a fight she had no intention of abandoning. The proposal called for mandatory transparency in all government tech partnerships, consent-based biometric use, and criminal penalties for unauthorized surveillance of private citizens. More importantly, it required notification, real, readable, plain language notices delivered to anyone whose data was being collected, analyzed, or scored. No more hidden clauses, no more coded silence. She knew the bill would face opposition. Lobbyists were already circling. Some of her own colleagues would call it overreach, too idealistic, too disruptive to the so-called efficiency they had grown used to. But Jasmine didn't care. The old argument that the system is too complex no longer held weight. not when that complexity had been weaponized against the very people it was meant to serve. Later that day, she stepped into a closed-door strategy session with three other members of Congress, two Democrats, one Republican. All had seen their phones blow up after the hearing. All had constituents who had stories. One by one, they shared them. A small-town mayor who realized his community's new smart lighting system was mapping movement paths. A veteran whose benefits had been delayed after an AI misclassified his file. A high school senior who had been denied early college aid because his digital behavior profile didn't match the model of an ideal candidate. Every story was different, but the pattern was the same. "I thought this was about Musk," one congresswoman admitted. "Now I realize this is about all of us." Jasmine didn't nod. She didn't smile. She simply said, "Then let's make it count." Meanwhile, outside the Beltway, something else was brewing. Community organizers began drafting their own guidelines for local government contracts. Activists formed coalitions to audit school tech partnerships. Public interest lawyers offered pro bono support to families trying to access their own data records. Records they never knew existed. The movement wasn't centralized. It didn't need to be. It was rooted in something deeper than politics. It was fueled by the idea that people should not have to be perfect, invisible, or compliant to deserve privacy. As Jasmine left the meeting, her phone buzzed. A message from her staff. "Protests planned in 12 cities. Civil rights groups want to meet Monday. Tech Policy Committee wants you to testify again." She tucked the binder under her arm, stepped into the hallway, and smiled faintly. One battle had ended, but the war for dignity, transparency, and choice had only just begun. And this time the system wouldn't get to write the rules in secret, because now someone was watching them back. The Capitol quieted as dusk settled across Washington. Streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating a city that was, for all its noise and power, built on paper, people, and choices. Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, the day's binder still open on her desk. But she wasn't reading, not anymore. She was thinking, not about Musk, not even about the cameras or the code, but about the mothers, the veterans, the children, the ones who had been turned into data points by systems that had never asked their permission. In the stillness, she recalled something her grandmother once told her as a girl. "You can't protect everything, but you can choose what's worth defending." And now, after everything, Jasmine understood the truth in that more deeply than ever. This fight had never been just about privacy. It was about worth, who the system valued, who it watched, and who it protected. She stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the steps where protesters had gathered just hours before. Their signs were gone now, but the message remained, etched in chalk, bold and fading at once. "We are not your experiment." It wasn't anger that moved her in that moment. It was clarity. The understanding that leadership isn't about defending power. It's about defending the people who have none. In that hearing room, Jasmine had shown the nation what happens when truth is given the floor. When silence is broken not with outrage, but with precision, courage, and calm. And now the question wasn't what Elon Musk would do next. It was what we would. Because systems don't change just because someone gets caught. They change when enough of us decide to stop playing along. When we refuse to call surveillance safety. When we demand laws that see us, not score us. Jasmine turned from the window and returned to her desk. She picked up her pen, not to write a speech, but to underline one sentence in her bill. Consent is not a formality, it is the foundation of freedom. And in that moment, she understood something else. The future doesn't belong to the people who build the most powerful machines. It belongs to the people who choose what's worth defending and refuse to be watched into silence. In a world where technology moves faster than conscience, silence can no longer be our default. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose a system, she reminded us that protecting freedom means protecting the people no one's watching out for. The lesson is simple but urgent. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. And just because it's invisible doesn't mean it's harmless. So ask yourself, who's being watched in your community and who's being forgotten? If you felt something today, don't let it fade. Speak up, share this story, and most importantly, choose what you will defend.